Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the Association for Consultancy and Engineering Emerging Professionals webinar, organised by the Northwest Committee. I'm Yusuf Salman, Deputy Chair of the Northwest Committee, and I'll be your host for today. Next slide, please, Chetna. A little bit about myself. Next slide again, please. My educational background is in civil engineering and project management. I've always had a passion for sustainability, and for just over 2 years now, I've been working at Atkins in the digital asset management practice within the transportation sector, and I'm currently based in Manchester, UK. So today we'll be focusing on net zero, and the Association for Consultancy and Engineering's Emerging Professionals have created a webinar series to explore how the climate generation will not only lead the industry's response to society's net zero ambitions, but a generational response too. Next slide, please. Two further leading campaigns delivered by the Association for Consultancy and Engineering Emerging Professionals network that are worth noting are the Future of Consultancy and Future of the Workplace. Whilst we don't have time to explore these in depth right now, I would say if you want to find out more information, please visit the link on the slide provided. This webinar is the first in a series. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm immensely proud that we've managed to gather them today. And next month, the Emerging Professionals Midlands Committee will explore this topic further. At the end, we will have some time for Q&A, and I'll explain how you can send your questions through on the next slide. So repeat listeners will know all of this, but it's always good to remind everyone. This is best experienced through your headphones, which will help to cut out the background noise. And if you turn off your microphone, you won't hear your breathing in your earphones, but you might still hear mine. To ask any questions, please go to the questions in your control panel. That is the sidebar that with the controls that will pop up to the right of your screen. And as mentioned before, we'll try and answer as many questions as possible, but don't worry, we'll also answer any others we haven't had time to cover after the webinar. So don't worry if you miss anything. We will be uploading this to our website in the next few days. So if you want to listen again, you can. So I'd like to hand over to Poppy Kettle now from the Environmental Industries Commission, sister organisation to the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, and she will be exploring the topic from a policy level.
Thank you, Yusuf. Yes, so next slide, please, Chetna. And next slide again. Yeah, so COVID-19 has obviously highlighted the importance of resilience for us within society and infrastructure. And there's a general consensus that more concentration needs to be put into net zero projects as a whole. Despite the postponement of COP26, which is the annual conference that would have happened in October this year, the ACE-EIC net zero report is still going to be released in November, and it's coming towards its final stages of research. So as an overview, if you go to the next slide, Chetna, we ran a survey in March this year seeking insights from experts across ACE and EIC members, and we found that technical feasibility in terms of the way that net zero projects are being run was not the main challenge that was holding us back from achieving net zero as a society. The main pressures that we encountered were surrounding client expectations, planning frameworks, and regulatory challenges, amongst a few other things. But in order to achieve net zero, it's essential that these pressures are resolved to meet the technical capacities that we already do possess. So the ACE and EIC Net Zero Task Force is built of leaders across the engineering and consultancy sectors. And they then run through all of these different outputs. And following the survey, which is at the top of here, of the assessments of CCC pathways is the description, we met in order to identify the different sectors that lack significant research into how to mitigate the challenges that come up. With the challenges that were faced in the ports and rail sectors being of the most immediate concern, we then have conducted 2 workshops bringing together leaders within these sectors to further inform the research being done by ACE and EIC. And we're also conducting, we had a roads workshop also last week looking at net zero, and then next week we're having another one to do with buildings, primarily in the public sector. And then looking at the 2045 timeline for net zero for Scotland, as 2050 is the main target that we're looking at for net zero in the UK as a whole. Scotland have a shorter timeline. So we had a meeting with Michael Mattison, who's a member of Parliament in Scotland, that we're creating a paper for the Scottish Government on how to realise the net zero 45 target. And then we've been speaking to people working in Scottish infrastructure and net zero on the main challenges and the capacity for ACE and EIC members to support Scottish Government to achieve that net zero agenda. So net zero, looking at the EIA analysis, net zero frameworks have not been interpreted into the planning system, which is definitely essential in reaching the UK net zero targets. So considering that ACE have been working with people in this area for a long time, we've collaborated with Lancaster University to create a paper assessing the roles of environmental impact assessments in meeting the UK net zero 2050 targets. And then the paper is looking at the qualitative and quantitative results of the planning system based on interviews with leaders across the industry, lots of ACE, EIC members who might be here today. So thank you if that applies to you. And the way that the planning system may develop to facilitate the changes that are needed in the infrastructure industry as a whole, as well as sector by sector changes necessary. So throughout the project, we've interviewed hundreds of member experts throughout the engineering consultancy sector who've helped to inform our research and shape the project as a whole. Then in doing that, we've learned of many case studies that highlight the amazing work that members are doing in the progress towards net zero. And so we're creating a database of member case studies. And then as net zero is an emerging, and obviously it's a very dynamic space to be working in at the moment. We're also working towards a map of members and wider stakeholders that have projects or initiatives in net zero, and looking at the crossover there so that there can be more of a chance for collaboration and also a directive way that we can move towards achieving net zero. So next slide, please, Chair. And I think that I've covered this. So next slide as well. Yes, so moving on from the project, we're looking at a more national view of things, and also like a more localized view towards the way that you look at net zero. So COVID-19 has been like a huge issue that's really progressed and also caused complications for the decarbonisation of the UK. The government's obviously been preoccupied with that crisis. COP26 has been postponed, so it's looking at the ways that we can try to continue to progress things whilst also understanding that we're in a different context at this point. Next slide, please. So this is obviously just giving a bit of background as we're in September, but the way that these things have come out, and then December now is the time that the CCC will be advising government on the 6th carbon budget, and then next year now will be COP26, which will then push back all the rest of the COP conferences by a year. Next slide, please. So yes, so the question is, should government use capital or labour-intensive CCC net zero recommendations as measures to boost the economy? What would be the best way to boost the economy? And these are all the questions that we're asking on the deep dives that we're doing at the moment. There are no current restrictions on the bailouts being given by government to get out of the COVID crisis, but whether or not it would be helpful to give that kind of restriction on carbon polluters, for example, aviation and things like that, and how that would then help to progress the net zero agenda, and how we can use that time better, use the fact that we're in obviously a global pandemic to then help progress this situation that's been held back at the moment. Yeah, okay. And then looking at the, I've just become very aware of time. So throughout the project, and moving on from the project that we were running to a more localized view, a key challenge for policymakers is how to encourage economic growth while reducing carbon emissions and driving sustainability. So the Clean Growth Strategy, which was released by government earlier this year, aims to build on efforts to date to help the UK seize future opportunities to decarbonise. And the Clean Growth Challenge is particularly important in the north, which is home to a significant proportion of the UK's carbon intensive initiatives and industries, and is a traditional hub for energy production and energy industries as a whole in the UK. So local industrial strategies facilitate closer partnerships and establish new ways of working between national and local government and the public and private sectors. So global leaders have recognised, obviously, as I've mentioned, the need to combat climate change, work towards net zero, and recognise that within our local but also national society. So the UK played a key role in shaping the Paris Agreement, which is it was basically a conference that they decided that we would be working towards a more climate conscious society, and the government's now committed the UK to ending their carbon emissions, which came on the back of the protests last year. So through the framework of carbon budgets and financial support for renewable regeneration, the UK has already been successful in decoupling the historical relationship between economic growth and carbon emissions having reduced emissions by 42%, while also growing the economy by 72% since 1990. However, net zero will require a further step change to continue this thread of clean growth, and it will require radical transformation rather than slow transformation, not just of the energy system, but of all aspects of the economy, from domestic and industrial demand to heating and transport, through to supply chains, freight networks, and all things like that. And all regions of the economy will need to play their part rather than just looking at the infrastructure as the way forward, though that will need to be the driving factor. So in response to the urgency of the need to address climate change, many local authorities have gone further than the net zero target on a localized basis. And I think looking at that is probably the way forward. For example, Greater Manchester and then the Leeds City region have targets to be net zero by 2038. And then many local authorities in the region have declared climate emergencies, again signalling the need to go faster on decarbonisation than national budgets and targets. And as technology and business innovation continue to develop in ways of decarbonising, achieving clean growth is shifting from challenge to opportunity. The question facing national and local business and policymakers is how to make the most of that opportunity. And that is what's the most important thing. So government estimates that low carbon economy could grow by 11% per year between 2015 and 2030. So to realise the potential, government has raised its investment in low carbon innovation by £2.5 billion allocated between 2015 and 2021, covering transport, energy, cross-sector investment, smart systems, homes, businesses and industry, and land use. But alongside the clean growth strategy, the industrial strategy identifies clean growth as one of the 4 challenges. So the industrial strategy aims to boost productivity and earning power throughout the UK by investing in innovation, skills and infrastructure. So far, sector deals partnerships between government, local authorities and industry have been made in offshore wind and nuclear sectors. Chetna, how am I doing for time, by the way?
You're okay, Poppy. I think you'll need to be finishing soon.
Okay, I'll speak faster. So thank you. So the scale of public funding and private finance is committed under sector by sector deals that demonstrate the real appetite that we've been noticing in some of our work to leverage public-private partnerships to unlock the potential of low carbon economies. So the government's green finance strategy aims to align private sector finance with clean, environmentally sustainable and resilient growth supported by government action. So to conclude, energy and clean growth in the north of England, which is the region's home to the raw materials, human effort and infrastructure that catalyzed the industrial revolution that's kind of led to this point to begin with. So that needs to be the place where it needs to start. So the north continues to generate 41% of England's electricity and consumes 28% of its of the energy that goes into the national grid. However, the energy output is predominantly made up of carbon emitting energy generation, and that then causes 26% of the UK's total UK emissions. So at the same time, the North's economy is also more carbon intensive than the UK average. So in part, it's playing quite a vital role in the way that carbon emissions are occurring in the UK. So it's a heavier industry and a heavier area than the UK in general. So emissions have been reduced significantly in that area most recently, but this has partly been at the cost of economic growth. So the Northeast region has experienced the largest percentage decline in emissions of any UK region over the last decade due to industrial closures rather than changes in the infrastructure. However, alongside its long established nuclear generation capacity, which is larger than any area of the UK pretty much combined, the North also developed a significant and growing renewable energy generation base. So through investment in research and development centres, the North is also home to leading expertise, amazing universities, incredible initiatives, which we've been looking into quite a lot, and also is leading the way with hydrogen technology in working in net zero. So if capitalised on, if we actually put enough effort in, the North's traditional strengths that made it the base of and the hub of all of the emissions that are coming out of the UK could actually be used to make the UK a different, and very much the North could be a powerhouse for the new kind of green net zero energy evolution. I think that's all I have to say.
Oh, thank you so much, Poppy. I think there's some really interesting research going on there. And I also believe, I'm an optimist, so we can see COVID-19 impacts as an opportunity to progress the net zero agenda. So thank you very much for that. We look forward to the reports.
Thank you. Thank you.
Next we have Chris Hudson, the Institute of Civil Engineering Northwest Chair, and I'm really pleased we're able to collaborate with the ICE today. So Chris, thank you. The stage is all yours.
Thank you, Youssef. We just want to hit the next slide. Okay, so State of the Nation 2020. First and foremost, I will introduce myself on the next slide, but I just want to tell you what State of the Nation 2020 is. State of the Nation 2020 is a report that has been written by the Institution of Civil Engineers to examine the contribution of the UK's infrastructure systems in achieving net zero for 2050. Now, if we just project ourselves, 2050 is only 30 years away, which means we need to start actioning now. We're already looking at things on the horizon, such as power station at Hinkley Point, looking at tidal barrage projects across multiple wind farms are being built offshore to try and generate electricity. And as you travel across the country, you'll see a lot of solar panel farms as well. So there's lots going on, but obviously we've got to try and tackle construction in a much larger prospect in terms of what we're building, how we build it, and how the end product is operated. So my name's Chris Hudson. I'm a chartered civil engineer. I work for Volker Stevin. I also work for Volker Infra. Now that's really interesting because Volker Stevin build a lot of flood defences, a lot of coastal defences. So I'm currently combating climate change. But also I work for Volker Infra in the high voltage and renewable sector, building onshore cabling routes for some of the UK's largest wind farms. So really interesting and diverse company that I work for at the minute, and really heavily involved in trying to tackle net zero already. Next slide, please. So the State of the Nation 2020 Net Zero report is written on 7 core subjects. And of those 7 core subjects, there are 10 recommendations that come out of the report. So the key thing is, as I've already mentioned, the need to mitigate climate change is not new, and it's required now. Climate change presents a major threat to the world's people, environment, economies and health, and civil engineers are the people to tackle that. The UK has had a statutory target of reducing carbon since 2008, We've not done terrific on that, and obviously the government have reintroduced kind of a new benchmark of net zero target in mid-2019 for 2050. It's vital that infrastructure systems within the UK are targeted in terms of what can we do. If we look at some of the aspects that we need to contribute and manage better, it's the energy sector, the transport sector, and the utilities sector. Transport and energy alone account for around 60% of the UK's CO2 emissions. So the core output of the State of the Nation 2020 Net Zero report is policy, influencing policy within government to make sure that they put the necessary benchmarks in place to guide the country, the businesses, the engineers, the consultants, those that manage the assets, driving those forward, those people that are going to use it, the public, and obviously we need to influence skills as well. So the core objective through policy is to influence the national infrastructure strategy. And the Institution of Civil Engineers are encouraging the government to pull together a net zero infrastructure plan without putting something on paper that gives clear guidance. We're all going to go in different directions and we're not going to be aligned. So the core thing is to strengthen that policy making process. We then need to look at developing infrastructure. And as I've mentioned earlier, as part of the national infrastructure strategy, we need to start looking at how we're going to do that. The key thing is for the Green Book to be reformed to better reflect net zero target in project appraisal and assessments. For those of you that don't know what the Green Book is, it's the HM Treasury's kind of document that provides guidance on how to appraise policies, programs and projects. We need to ensure that businesses respond. We need to make sure that there is a just transition, and I'm going to cover those two specifics in later slides. We need to determine who's going to pay, whether it's going to be private investment or whether it's going to be public investment. We need to engage with the public. There's no point creating a difference if we don't educate the public to embrace that and use it as we need. And we need to make sure that skills are accentuated such that we've got a good skill set to drive forward carbon capture and improving that we realigned to net zero and manage it correctly, and education to develop those skill sets is key. So all those things that I've mentioned over those 7 headings are all featured within the State of the Nation report. Now I'm conscious that I've got 10 minutes to tell you all about the report, so what I suggest you do is have a look on the internet and source out State of the Nation 2020. It's not easy reading. It's not easy to break it down into 10 minutes. But what I would suggest is pick it up and have a read of it section by section every now and again until you've absorbed what's controlled within there. So that's a brief summary. If I can go on to the next slide, please. So ensuring businesses respond is one of the focal points that I've been asked to talk to you about today. So recommendation 4 within the report suggests that models of regulation should be updated to promote the achievement of net zero and enable owners and managers to regulate assets and take longer term and more flexible strategic planning and investment decisions. At the minute, regulation models have a really short vision. Just bear with me. So what we're encouraging within our statement here is that through regulation, industry can be incentivized to look beyond the short term and encouraged to plan beyond current regulatory cycles. This achievement to net zero will require transformative investments such as decarbonising heating or developing charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, which will more closely align with the Committee on Climate Change's carbon budgets or climate change projections. Alternatively, net zero may require regulators to incentivize greater investment in upgrading or retrofitting existing assets rather than going for new build. So the whole life cycle approach also needs to be addressed, looking at the opportunity to reuse, upcycle or retrofit. Next slide, please. We also need to look at procurement policy within the ensuring businesses respond, bullet points within the report. Through procurement policy, clients should require better collection, sharing and use of data on infrastructure assets to enable improved decision making in the context of net zero target. Now, a lot of these recommendations are very worded and difficult to understand. This one is perhaps one of the easiest and yet one of the most bizarre. When it talks about data and infrastructure assets, we're already doing this as engineers, as consultants, as contractors, by digital engineering. There is more and more BIM modeling starting to appear on our laptops and our computer systems. We are managing data. We are looking back at what we did previously and what we're going to do in the future. We're learning from our mistakes, but we're also learning what works and what doesn't. The whole BIM and digital engineering perspective that we all embrace now allows us to have an effect on the management in terms of developing and retrofitting, because we've got a model that we can work with, we can communicate it with our supply chains, we can change things, trial things, make sure that it fits before we take the steps forward. It improves that decision making, it saves costs, and it definitely reduces carbon. Next slide, please. The next point within the State of the Nation report is ensuring a just transition. Now, what does that mean? Power and responsibilities for infrastructure policy and service delivery should continue to be devolved to ensure the economic opportunities of net zero transition are distributed through the UK. Now, Poppy's touched on this a little bit. We're talking a lot about the North, but also about the Midlands. We've got the Northern Powerhouse. We've got the West Midlands Engine. These are both terms, buzzwords, as you could call them, that are all about creating a levelling up agenda that allows powers to be pushed north and into the Midlands outside of London-centric to enable us to embrace and capture and drive forward how we're going to tackle net zero regionally, rather than waiting for government decision and then looking for kind of the minions of the local authorities or the regulatory bodies to be able to manage. So there's going to be more power devolved around the country. Next slide, please. So the next point that I've been asked to talk to you about is how do we actually empower emerging professionals? And I'm using this slide just to demonstrate the current ICE president's future leaders within the institution of the civil engineers. So there are 6 presidents' future leaders. This has been an aspect of the institution for the last 3 years now. So this talk was originally going to be delivered by a previous future leader, Louisa Ferguson, one of my colleagues at the ICE Northwest. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to deliver the talk, so you stuck with me. She has been involved with emerging professional involvement by sitting on steering group since in 2018. Now, what did that steering group do, and how does that embrace the younger emerging professionals? Well, what it allows is for the emerging professionals to actually step up and get involved with developing the State of the Nation report, which has now been published in 2020. So we're talking about 2 years of evolution, from desk studies to consulting, doing surveys, public interaction, looking at the responses from various people. So just to give a couple of examples there, we've got Holly Smith and Chris Lansborough, who have done some blogs on the ICE website, and by all means go to the ICE website, it's free to view. There's lots of information when you type in State of the Nation, a timeline of evolution of how it's been produced, but we really have been empowering our future leaders to develop the report that was published this year. Next slide, please. So the most recent thing that we've delivered is we've taken the report, we've gathered 10 recommendations, and we've then written a policy paper. That policy paper is now being passed to the government to consider a plan for transitioning infrastructure to net zero. It outlines 4 key areas. The future energy mix, pathways of decarbonising transport, pathways for decarbonising heat and reducing emissions from harder to abate sectors. Next slide, please. Now this is a really great but simple item to discuss. It's the energy trilemma, the sustainability of energy, the affordability of energy, the energy security. So we've talked about how businesses respond, how asset owners need to look at the way that they regulate things. This paper examines the important policy choices of the future makeup of the UK's energy mix, which must be made, including considerations on trade-offs in terms of how to decarbonise, ensure that security, and to minimise costs for the end users, you and I. Next slide, please. It also explores why decarbonisation of transport must be prioritised. Just looking at this graph, and I note that Poppy mentioned earlier the CO2 emissions levels. 34% is transport, 26% is energy. These are two key elements that we need to focus on. You also look at the other items there that are high on. There's 19 that are non-infrastructure related and 18% that are residential. So you can see that the way of living, the way that we heat our houses, the way that we are going to try and energy conserve and do other things are going to be at rapid change over the next 5-10 years in view that we need to action now, not wait till 2050. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, the paper examines the important policy choices of the future makeup of UK's energy mix that must be made, including considering trade-offs in terms of how to decarbonise energy security and minimise energy costs. I think that's me done. So next slide, please. Yeah, so thanks very much for asking me to come and talk to you guys. Please seek out State of the Nation 2020 infrastructure and the 2050 net zero target, and also look out for the policy paper. There's much more contained within that I haven't got time to talk to you about today because it's a vast subject. Thank you, Youssef.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd certainly also recommend participants to read up on the State of the Nations. And, I resonate with some key actions you spoke about, life cycle evaluations, moving to digital solutions such as BIM. It's a big part of what I do within the practice I work in. Also situated within the transportation sector, a significant emitter of CO2. So thank you for your time, Chris, appreciate it. Next, we have Stephanie Barton from WSP, who will be discussing the topic from an organizational perspective.
Hi there, everybody. Next slide, please. So I'll be presenting from WSP's perspective. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick introduction to WSP, you may not have heard of us before. We're an international global engineering and consultancy firm. We've got over 7,000 people in our UK and Ireland offices, and we do a wide range of different kind of projects and advice. So we do everything from property to transport, planning, energy, etc. So next slide, please. One of the reasons I really like working at WSP is that we like to think not only of what we're doing, but actually of the impact on the environment around us. We like to think of the future, which I'll get onto into a second, but also the impacts that we're creating to our environment in the projects that we're doing. So Martin A. Smith, our CEO, has made some strong, has really highlighted the importance of this. And as a result of that, WSP is set to become a net zero business by 2025. And this is an achievement which we've won the Global Good Company of the Year award for. Next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit at a high level about what we're doing internally, we've got a roadmap to be able to set this out. So we originally thought about being carbon neutral, but then we shifted to align with global targets. We also, we purchase offsets. We think about how we're traveling and try and reduce our carbon outputs in those methods. We think about our leases and try where we can to have green leases. We have carbon champions in our offices. So internally, we're doing everything we can to be thinking about how we can reduce our own emissions. Next slide, please. But as I mentioned, we like to look forward into the future and try and think of what we're doing there and design to be ready for the future. So that's where our global initiative, Future Ready, came from. Next slide, please. So as we look at the designs and the advice we're putting out there, we've realised that they've got really long design lives. For example, a railway has a 100-year design life. And so the designs and advice we're giving is out there for the long term. So we've got to start thinking about, when this is being operated in the future, how is the landscape going to change? How will the world be different? And we've got to think about these things now to prevent retrofit. So what we do, obviously the future is quite an uncertain thing, but we use trend-based analysis to be able to understand a little bit more what we predict and we expect to happen. So this trend analysis kind of falls into 4 main themes. Next slide, please. So one of the themes is climate. Obviously, climate change, really big issue at the moment. So we're thinking about heavier downpours and the impacts that have a result, such as flooding, thinking about global sea levels rising and places getting warmer. Also, we're getting more multi-hazard events. So, you know, storm, rain, wind, all happening at once. Next slide, please. Resources. So we're thinking about our changes in resources and being more efficient. We're trying to think about how we can be more flexible in what we design. Also, the circular economy. So moving away from single product use and moving more towards recycling and that cycle of, instead of wasting, you know, using it again and again. Also, biodiversity is really important here. So thinking about our nature and our wildlife and the importance that has to our planet in retaining them. Next slide, please. Society. So our demographics are changing. We're becoming more diverse. We're becoming more globally connected. People that are born today are more and more likely to live to be over 100. Our population is increasing. We're expecting to be 73 million by 2040. We're also thinking about how our society is changing within itself. So the rise of Fitbit culture, you know, you're tracking your steps, you don't want to be sedentary, you want to be moving about, but also all key concerns in terms of mental health and loneliness that we're seeing arising. And COVID, of course, has had massive impacts on our societal trends and our behaviour changes. Next slide, please. Technology. So this is thinking about things like the digital economy. I just touched on COVID, but that's seeing how we've all got new methods of working. We're all the majority of us working remotely, and that's because of our increases in IT and technology. We've also got a rise in the demand culture. So if you look at things like Uber and Netflix, it's all streaming. Nobody physically owns anything anymore. We're thinking about materials we use, so self-healing pavements, solar panels on roads, different things that we could use and better use, new innovations and ideas, but also things like traveling differently. So if you look at our technology changes in our vehicles, we're going to see a future of connected and autonomous vehicles. So how will that change our landscapes? Next slide, please. So as I kind of touched across those 4 trends there, just quickly at a high level, we've got climate, resources, society and technology. But obviously the point of today is we're focusing on net zero. And net zero has an impact across all of those 4 themes. Next slide, please. So as has already been touched upon, climate and net zero are strongly linked. As a result of the Paris Agreement, we're using science-based targets to reduce our global warming based on our carbon emissions. Next slide, please. In terms of resources, we're thinking about the materials we use, trying to reduce that embodied carbon. If you look at the graph here, you can see that although we're making some good inroads in reducing our carbon from construction, we've still got a long way to go if we want to meet those net zero targets. So trying to think about how we can do that. Next slide, please. We've got, in terms of society, so we've seen things like the climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion. You know, people are making these public statements of they care about what's happening to our planet. But also you can see it in terms of consumer trends. So if you look at energy companies where you can select to be with those as an energy company if they use solar, wind, you know, prefer to use those methods. Other things in terms of if you look at the high street, so H&M have a sustainable clothing range. And so consumers are driving us to be greener and are really thinking about their carbon footprint. Next slide, please. And technology. So a lot of the benefits that will come from technology is thinking about smart technology. So being able to kind of use the data we're getting, collecting, being able to predict how we're using our energy, better utilize what's on the grid, but also in terms of the actual assets that we're using. So making sure that they're more energy efficient, they've got automatic switch off, things like that. So I've touched upon a few of our trends and also what we're doing in terms of thinking about them. I just wanted to dive into a couple of examples of how we've actually applied this. So for example, the Isle of Wight. So WSP were advisors for the Isle of Wight Council's Highway Private Finance Initiative scheme. And the Isle of Wight Council really wanted to think about them being an eco-island and the fact that they want to have the smallest carbon footprint in England. So they were core values to them. And what they did was, when they released the bid and the tender for the new road, they actually set as part of it a carbon and a water footprint. And these were valued in the same way that you'd set out the costs for the project. And they were graded, and the bid went to the overall best idea, best carbon footprint, best price. And then actually going forward, as it's operational and as they're using it, if the carbon footprints and the water footprints don't live up to what was predicted in the bid, they get the penalties like they would do it for overspend on a project. So it's a really strong example of where a council is thinking about what it wants to put out there and including that in terms of how it's taking its offering and its services. Next slide, please. Chilworth Roundabout was a WSP highways maintenance scheme. It's just off the M3. And this is a really strong example of where we've applied circular economy principles to our maintenance and redesign. So for example, where they've tried not to use new materials. They've used recycled polymer and curbs instead of concrete. But the other thing they've done, so you can just about see on the edge of the roundabout, there is a red bus lane. Now, previously that red bus lane was going out and being painted every 5 years. What they've proposed in the design of this is actually to use red asphalt. And by using red asphalt, as it wears, the core of it is red, so it will wear through and through, and it will remain to be red. And that will last for 25 to 30 years. So not only is that having a benefit in terms of resources, it's in terms of time, output, and also the workers' safety of not having to go to the network to redo that red consistently year on year. Next slide, please. So Paddington Square is a project where to upgrade Paddington Station, and WSP has been developed the initial design. And one of the things they wanted to prioritise was greater energy efficiency and ensuring that emissions will continue to decline. The ways in which they've done this is they've thought about electric heat pumps instead of using your gas-fired combined heat and power. As you can see, it's a gorgeous glass building. They've done a double skin facade, which will trap the heat between the layers and then transfer it out between the building using ventilation pockets. Another thing that they've done is they've applied blinds, which are able to open and close automatically, and that will optimize the solar gain, but also it's got the smart feature of using it as daylight controls and improve energy efficiency further. Overall, the building's emissions are expected to fall by 37% by 2050 compared to the original combined heat and power option. Thank you. Next slide. So 22 is Bishopsgate. So this is another building that WSP has been involved with. And things that they've thought about here is to make sure that its overall embodied carbon is below the targets of a net zero building. So they've thought about the concretes in the floor. So they've used a lightweight concrete that is actually 30% lighter than normal concrete. This has a positive impact on the build, the foundation size, the craneage time. Also, the structural engineers have actually been able to reuse
I think we might have possibly lost Steph there.
And 100% of these carbon. Yep. Oh, yeah, sorry. And then finally, the last example, if I just skip on to that one, is the Trans-Pennine Tunnel. So the Trans-Pennine Tunnel is a really strong example of where we don't just think about the carbon in the design that we're doing, we think about the carbon in our future in the designs we're putting forward. So if this tunnel goes ahead, it'll be available in 2035. And what will happen there is, if you think of the landscape of our transport, it will hopefully have completely changed. So there'll be a rise in zero emission vehicles. And as you think of a tunnel, one of the key concerns of a typical tunnel is how to get rid of the ventilation for the petrol and diesel cars. if we're looking at zero emission vehicles, that will no longer be one of our key concerns. However, things like with electric vehicles, an engine is more likely to combust and have more of a significant issue and then reignite. So thinking about how when we design this tunnel, it's going to have to be different from what we've done before, thinking of the future. So that was it for me today. Looking forward to some questions later. Thank you, Yusuf.
Thank you so much, Steph. It's really great to hear about the way WSP has been mobilising to support the UK achieving net zero. I think every little helps in the bigger picture, and some really great organisation ambitions for 2025. So thank you for your time, Steph. Last but not least, we have Johnny Sadler, Programme Director of Manchester Climate Change Agency. And this one is close to my heart as I'm a resident of Manchester. So Johnny, the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Great, thanks Yusuf. Great to be with you all this afternoon. I think I've only got a short amount of time, so I'll be brief. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a bit of a snapshot of Manchester, but I'm going to talk to you in a way which will hopefully be relevant to a number of the cities that you will work in around the UK. I'd talk to you from the perspective of the city's climate change agency. We're a not-for-profit organisation that was set up 5 years ago to make sure that the city did the right thing on climate change in line with the Paris Agreement. Next slide. So I'll start here. This is from the city's overarching Our Manchester strategy, but you will increasingly see statements like this in city strategies around the UK and beyond. So for us, the commitment we've made is that Manchester will play its full part in limiting the impacts of climate change. As I say, you will see versions of that in cities around the UK and beyond. There are currently over 10,000 cities, for example, signed up to the Covenant of Mayors initiative, which is a voluntary scheme for cities to make commitments on climate change. Next one. This document here unpacks in more detail what we mean when we say playing our full part on climate change. So the Manchester Climate Change Framework is our strategy on climate change for the coming 5 years. It picks up on that high level playing our full part statement and then goes on to define in more detail what we mean, what our targets are, and what we need to do as a city to meet them. Next one. The framework sets out 4 high-level objectives. So the first 2, which you would expect to see, but 1 on staying within our carbon budgets, 2 on climate adaptation and resilience, but then a further couple of objectives on health and well-being and economy. And the point that we're trying to make here is that, as well as this being about doing the right thing in relation to the Paris Agreement, city action on climate change is also legitimately about achieving socioeconomic benefits for local residents and businesses. Next one. These are a couple of headlines from some work we did a couple of years ago to try to articulate that socioeconomic case. So, for example, 10 people die prematurely every day due to poor air quality across Greater Manchester. There's a cost of 1.3 billion pounds to the local economy through congestion. We have a latest count about 16% of all of the homes in Manchester. We have families living in fuel poverty, and that costs the NHS in the region of 17 million pounds every year. They're having to treat people with respiratory issues. There's a huge economic opportunity here, so potential to treble the size of the low carbon sector across Greater Manchester over the next 20 years. And we also see the need for 30,000 new jobs in the environment and sustainability sector within the city. So the opportunity here to make Manchester a real hub for green skills and employment. Next one. So I'll just unpack what we mean then by this term playing our full part. This is the scope of our carbon reduction commitment. So you'll recognise direct emissions on the left from buildings and ground transport. You will find that in every city climate change strategy. But we've also been really keen to include the full scope of emissions that we're responsible for. So you'll see there aviation emissions, that little mustardy slice at the bottom. That's about 4 to 5% of the total emissions from flights from Manchester Airport. Those are the flights taken by Manchester residents. But we also have included within our strategy all the flights from Manchester Airport. We're not saying that the city alone is responsible for all those emissions, but we think we've got a key role to play in working with government in order to address them. And then the third slice you'll see in there is indirect or consumption-based emissions. So the emissions that are embedded in the products and services that we use. So we've heard a little bit about that from Steph in the previous conversation. That's furniture, clothes, construction materials, etc., etc. That's in the region of 60% higher than our direct emissions, and is clearly an area where we need to take ambitious action as well. Next one. This slide is a profile of what our direct emissions budget looks like. So it's a 15 million tonne budget to spend between 2018 and 2100. We currently spend about 2 million tonnes every year. That's our annual direct emissions output. So at the current rate, we will spend all of our budget by 2025. And that's supposed to last us until 2100. So that's the equivalent of getting all of your wages, getting paid on Monday the 1st of the month and spending all of your wages by 2 o'clock on Wednesday of the first week. Really key point to make here is that this is not about zero carbon end dates. This is about staying within a limited carbon budget. And what that means for us is reducing the city's emissions by at least 50% over the next 5 years. Next one. This is what happens if you don't achieve the annual rates of reduction. So we've got a 13% year-on-year target. We failed to meet that over the last 2 years. So we now need to increase that to 15% to catch up. If we continue on that trajectory, so if we fail to catch up before 2022, we'll have to increase that rate to 18%. And if we continue on the current trajectory out to 2025, we need to hit a 31% annual reduction in emissions to stay within the budget. So again, really key point to make here, this is not about zero carbon end dates. This is about staying within a carbon budget and the need to catch up if you don't make those emission savings in the immediate term. Next one. I won't talk to the aviation and consumption-based objectives. Yeah, skip to the next one. I won't talk to this one in detail, but we have set out 15 actions that we need every organisation and every individual in the city to take for the city to meet its climate change targets. So you can pick that up on our website. Next one. Every city in the UK will recognise this set of figures. This comes from national government. It's not particularly helpful unless you have significant local powers and funding to intervene in a top-down way, which UK local authorities don't have. So next slides. So we've established a much more bottom-up approach to addressing the city's emissions. Those purple wedges you can see there represent the members of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership. They are 60 organisations from across 10 sectors, collectively with responsibility for over 20% of the city's emissions. So they're an engagement mechanism that enables me to have a direct relationship with sources of the city's emissions. Next one. And then just last, to wrap up on where we need to go next as a city, we need to expand those purple wedges. We need to reach more than 20% of the city's emissions directly. We need to embed our climate change commitments into other strategies and policies so that we've got that consistency across the entirety of the city's policy framework. We will be refreshing our climate change framework next year to set out in more detail what we need to do. And we've got a number of projects underway where we're sharing best practice and learning with cities across the UK and Europe. And the last slide for me is just some more information on all of those documents and my contact details. So thanks very much. Good to be with you, and back with you, Youssef.
Thank you so much, Johnny. Some really interesting challenges, and you know, as a resident here, I think it's in good hands, and I hope we can meet these ambitions. Whilst we are running out of time or running over, I would like to ask one question, Johnny, please, and this one's for you. We haven't really mentioned the pandemic, but what positive impact on emissions did the forced actions of COVID-19 have on Manchester air quality as a result of reduced CO2 emissions? Is there any data available?
It's a really good question. We haven't got the data yet for CO2 emissions. We probably won't get that until next year now. There is data available. I don't have it to hand on air quality emissions, but needless to say, there was clearly an improvement. I guess the point I would make about COVID and the recovery is that, importantly, I think what it's done is it's given people the headspace to think about the kind of city that they want to be in. So what I think we're starting to see is a call for the city to recover from an economic perspective, but also to be a much greener and fairer city. So we get to a really interesting point here where now the city's climate change objectives start to become mainstream and aligned with the city's economic objectives. You'll see a bit more about that on our website as well. There's a green recovery section in there. But Yusuf, apologies, I'm going to have to jump off now for another call, but really happy to pick up any of the questions offline.
Thank you so much, Johnny. That's brilliant. I think we're going to wrap up for today, everyone. To all participants, many thanks for listening in. We hope you found this interesting. A huge thank you to all of our panelists, Poppy, Chris, Steph, and Johnny. Your time is really, really appreciated. Just a reminder, we have recorded this webinar. We'll be sending a link out later today so that you can refer back, share with colleagues, etc. And the slides will be added to the Association for Consultancy and Engineering website. See you all next time.